Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar hosted by Hexaware titled Evolving Role of Cognitive Contact Centers in Virtual Clinical Trials. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Any questions that we do not have time to answer during the session will be responded to you after the webinar. For your information, we'll also be running a live poll today. Please note that the responses are anonymous and the results will only be shared as a percentage result. It is now my pleasure to introduce you the moderator for today's webinar, Steve Lozardo, Vice President, Healthcare Solutions Mobility. With more than 25 years of experience, Steve held leadership roles at IMS Health, PwC and Versapan, a joint venture between Quintiles Transnational and McKesson focused on healthcare informatics and the generation of real-world evidence in support of clinical trials. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much. Just go to the next slide, please. The impacts of COVID-19 are broad and far-reaching, touching virtually every aspect of our lives. For clinical trial participants, this is particularly true whether they're researchers or patients. The impact is significant. As we're aware, there's an estimated 80% of non-COVID-19 trials were stopped or interrupted earlier this year as a result of the pandemic. There's been difficulties in starting new trials, particularly with patient recruitment and enrollment, which has always been fairly challenging for our industry. Travel restrictions increasingly are causing issues with patient retention. And ultimately, the risk concerns, and that might be the most important one, the risk concerns of researchers and patients causing sponsors to really rethink how they want to design trials and how they want to run trials. And that's really what brings us to the conversation today. We want to talk to you and share our thoughts with a very distinguished panel on clinical trials moving into a more virtual setting, as well as the role of contact centers in ensuring their success. So let's get started. Next slide. And the next slide. So for my panel today, I'm very excited to have both of these gentlemen. I have Jim Mulholland, who's a life science consultant, as well as instructor at Wake Tech Community College. Jim was a COO and a life science partner at MSRC Osmos, as well as the Vice President of Digital and Business Technology Innovation at Syneos Health. My other panelist is Ram Yelesarapu. He's a healthcare and technologies advisor. Ram actually co-founded Navitas Life Sciences, where he led their enterprise. They're a boutique CRO. He led their enterprise as the president and CEO for more than 15 years. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Steve. Thanks.
Yeah. As we get started, I do want to kind of provide a definition for the attendees. You're hearing a lot right now about virtual trials, decentralized trials, trial in the home, bring the trial to the patient. And the reality is we're talking about all of that. There's no clear definition in the industry that this differentiates those terms. So the definition we're using for our talk today is a virtual trial is one that utilizes telemedicine and digital health technologies. And it also implies that part or all of the trial is in the patient home versus in a trial site. All right. Now, I will point out the reality of a totally virtual trial, totally in a home trial is probably very rare and would be very challenging. So we look at it more as a hybrid trial that has aspects of in-home or virtual, as well as aspects of a more traditional trial. So for example, a patient may go to a trial site at initiation, but then most of the trial activities are occurring in the home, whether it's managing the patient, making sure they're taking their drugs or collecting data and other things, vital signs, in order to support the protocols of the trial. So with that said, let's get started. Jim, I really want to get your perspective on virtual clinical trials. What do you think the benefit is that people will realize moving to that kind of model in for clinical trials?
Sure, Steve. So what you're seeing today in healthcare, and more specifically in clinical trial conduct, is putting the consumer at the center of the universe. So in this case, it'd be the patient at the center of the universe, right? So with the Amazons of the world and Netflix, there's very highly customizable. As a consumer, you feel like you're in control of many things and can really decide where the next step should be. So the idea of patient centricity is core to success in virtual clinical trials, right? You increase retention with subjects; they stay in the trial throughout to completion, which saves lots of money and causes trials to finish on time. It allows the patients to provide real-time feedback as to how the trial is going for them through patient-reported outcomes, through some maybe digital technologies, right? So the other part of that is increased patient convenience, right? So as I alluded to, using technology to collect the feedback to also minimize travel, right? So the average US-based subject in a trial travels about 30 miles one way to get to their site. So removing that and allowing a lot of the activities to happen in the home is putting the patient at the center, increasing the convenience, and really reducing cost and putting the patient in a better position to feel good about the trial and get benefits from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. We hear that most often. It's patient centricity. It's about the patient, and that's true in all industries, but it's particularly true with clinical trials. But at the same time, obviously, if sponsors are going to go and invest in a virtual clinical trial, or an investigator is going to take part in a virtual clinical trial, there has to be some benefit to them. So, Ram, could you address that? What should a sponsor or investigator expect with respect to a virtual clinical trial approach?
Absolutely, Steve. Thank you for that question. So as you set the context, Steve, clearly it's decentralized clinical trials or hybrid trials. Decentralized trials, it's not a all or nothing concept. There is varying degrees of decentralization. So sites are certainly not ruled out in a traditional sense, but clearly virtualization, to the extent that patients are unable to get out of their houses, if you will, to get to sites, that needs to be catered to. When you look at the three cogs, if you will, patient, sites, and sponsors, clearly from a sponsor's perspective and a site perspective as well, while Jim said patient centricity and convenience are paramount, clearly sponsors stand to gain a whole lot, because in the traditional sense, the typical hurdles that you would face are site selection, site initiation, screening, and enrollment. And these are the typical bottlenecks and challenges. And if there is a way for us to speed up some of these activities and ensure that the timelines and the budgets are kind of held on to, if you will, more appropriately, I think that's a huge benefit to sponsors. So typically, eligibility screening and recruitment are the typical hurdles. I think in a virtual setting or in a hybrid setting, this speeds up the process of sponsors tend to gain. And from a PI or a site perspective, the burden gets reduced, essentially because you're able to deal with some of these without patients necessarily coming to sites.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, what's interesting, Ram, is I'm sold on the benefit of virtual trials, from what Jim shared around patients and the patient centricity keyword, patient convenience, and then the value proposition that you've just detailed for us with respect to sponsor and investigator efficiencies. But one of the things that I will say is that the technologies, the approaches have been around for a long time. And the adoption, now we're seeing it because of COVID, but it wasn't coming along that quickly. So are there things that if a sponsor is thinking about doing a virtual trial, Ram, that he needs to keep in mind, particularly with regulatory, because that's usually what people say. The regulatory environment maybe is something that I have to deal with. So if I was going to tell someone this is what you need to do in order to be successful implementing a virtual trial with respect to regulatory, how would you answer that question?
Absolutely, Steve. It's a great question. In fact, that is certainly a key consideration, actually. I mean, very earlier on in the process, or early on, it's important to understand the indication for which the study is being designed for. And right up at the front, the protocol needs to incorporate elements of decentralization up front, which means you need to take into account patients, sponsors, sites, of course, IRBs, and other service providers, technology providers included, to be able to design a better protocol, which is thin enough, yet effective enough to handle the decentralization aspect. So a lot of this planning has to happen up front, which also means whether it is a drug-related or a non-drug, non-protocol-related, the FDA, for example, in the US has the CDER and the CBER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, Centers for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Clearly, in a pre-IND meeting, I think these need to be discussed up front. The architecture, the study design, the risks and benefits of some of these decentralization aspects, that needs to be discussed. And if it's a non-drug, non-protocol-driven initiative, then there is a critical path innovation meeting that can be requested as well. So all these meetings ensure that the stakeholders of the trial system in the decentralized ecosystem are absolutely aligned right from the beginning, and that's vital, Steve.
Yeah, I can see that. It's investing in the upfront planning, understanding the regulatory environment, and winning support at that point. I would imagine that if you try to introduce a virtual trial approach after you've done your design, after you have your protocols defined, you're really not going to be very successful, and ultimately may have issues with regulatory authorities, correct?
Absolutely, Steve. So think about this. When COVID-19 happened, right about the May timeframe, global data reported about 1,100 non-COVID-19 related studies were either halted or they kind of slowed down tremendously. Of course, in June and July, they started picking up. But guess what? The very first thing these studies had to do, or the sponsors had to do, is to go get protocol amendments done, which is an expensive proposition. It delays everything. So those amendments can be costly, time consuming, everything gets delayed. Patients could lose interest and drop off. So many things could go wrong because of that stuff. So this upfront consideration, the planning and design of the protocol, to ensure that these elements are embedded right at the planning stage by incorporating patients' perspectives, IRBs, sponsors, sites, so on and so forth. This is extremely critical.
Okay, I take notes here because I learn something every time I talk to you two gentlemen. That's a key thing. Design up front. That's simple as that. If you want to be successful in a virtual clinical trial, design up front and keep your sponsors informed, keep your regulatory authorities informed, because it costs a lot more money doing it the opposite way. So Jim, one of the things we talked about is the fact that, just by our definition of a virtual trial, it includes digital technologies, whether it's telemedicine, connected devices. So, what are some of the best practices you've seen or you've implemented with respect to digital technology in order to enable a virtual clinical trial?
Yeah, so certainly digital technology is a core component of a successful virtual clinical trial, but it's not a panacea, right? So you have to use it in the right way. First and foremost, the technology has to be easily accessible and usable by the patient. If it's too complex, if it operates on technology that is just foreign to what they're used to, you're going to fall flat on your face. So the idea that you have apps that run on their cell phone, for example, their iPhone or Android, is a paradigm that most consumers are familiar with and can deal with. The way the data is passed back and forth to the clinical trial leadership needs to be also flexible as well. So it should automatically connect to their Wi-Fi and submit the data in a secure manner, right? So security is a key component of the architecture, must be secure, but it must also be flexible so that in the end, if the patient needs to come in for a visit, that still needs to occur, right? So for example, some studies require the gait of a subject to be measured through a heel sensor. And while that could be recorded on a phone, sometimes that's a little unwieldy for some patients. So in-visit is often needed for that as well. The other part of this too, Steve, is that, a lot of, as alluded to by Ram, a lot of trials had to be kind of on the fly adaptive to the COVID environment that has been brought upon us, right? So being able to not only get protocol amendments, but also just redo the way you practice your patient experience and then the way in practice it's actually done has been core. I saw a recent case study in an ACRO paper that a large CRO basically had to, on the fly, adjust to trial participants being in different locations than their home. So even while they were ready for them to be home care, the home moved from, say, Florida to New York. And so how was that blood draw going to happen in a state that was 1,000 or more miles away? And they were able to do that because of flexibility in their paradigm to do this, to bring on various new labs and to be able to have the technology adapt to the location awareness of these subjects. So a key of that is to make sure that you get design and feedback along the way from the patient as well, that they're going to give you their opinions about what's working right and what's not working right. And it's up to the sponsors of the trials to really be adaptive to those comments to make sure that they're improving the experience. Just like, again, these consumer-oriented businesses that have been doing it for a long time, how many surveys have you gotten from an Amazon or from others to say, what about this feature do you like or not like? And then they're adapting very quickly to that. I believe the same adoption for the digital technologies within clinical trials has to happen as well in order to be a success, that you need to gauge patient and patient groups in general to make this technology more usable and ensure the success of the trial.
Mm-hmm. Another nugget, I wrote it down: adaptive and agile approach. All right, within regulatory guidelines. All right, so I think those are great takeaways. Design it in up front, and I'll be saying that forever. And then adaptive and agile, because sometimes things happen unexpectedly, and you have to move very quickly. And I think the more communication you have, I think, Jim, you hit it on the head with patients. You can't forget they're the ones who are really operating or managing the day-to-day of your trial in some sense. Make sure they have the tools, the technologies that they can work with, and they have the support. But also keep in mind, like you said, you mentioned the IRB, we mentioned regulatory considerations. We have to always keep that in mind. Ram, are there any examples you can give from your experience with respect to virtual trials or in-home trials? Is that something that you've done in your past?
My experience has been in a traditional setting, but I'll tell you one thing though. Clearly, I think COVID-19 has pushed us all to adopt some of these technologies much faster. Think about this, right? And I like to typically break it down among the study startup phase, study conduct, and study closeout. And if you break it down in that sense, what comes very up at the very front of the whole thing is trying to do trial matching, eligibility screening, and let's say recruitment. The ability to leverage, for example, telehealth for making an appointment and doing this as in a virtual setting. At least when the patient is being informed of the risks and benefits of the study, the informed consent perhaps is being discussed with the patient. These could be done in a virtual setting. So telehealth module clearly has gained a lot of momentum now. And so that's something which I certainly see a lot of usage. And it allows the patient from the convenience of their homes to actually attend a virtual setting. This is an appointment. They're trying to analyze whether the patient's health condition allows him or her to be a part of the study. And so as part of that stuff, what's also been done, Steve, is as part of the ability for patients in the US to access their health records, if you have access to the EHR, EMR hub, you can actually do a much more thorough analysis by having access to the medication history, allergies, immunizations, clinical conditions. And think about the holistic nature with which you're able to do an assessment. And by the way, at this stage, the patient is not even recruited. So you're doing all prep leading up to the process. So with all these tools, it just allows somebody in a virtual setting to get some of these things faster. There are examples as you go down to study conduct and closeout, but right up front at the beginning, you could actually take advantage of some of these solutions for virtual setting.
Yeah. That's a great segue, and I was going to ask you about that. We keep talking about virtual trials, but at the same time, our history is in doing traditional trials, and there are differences. And you just laid out a really good perspective on what the differences are, what the benefits are. Talked about e-consent. We talked about telemedicine. Jim, one of the other big differences I see, and I want to get your perspective on it, is that the purpose of the trial is to collect the data to meet the trial endpoints. All right, now all of a sudden a patient's not within a site. Maybe you're not collecting information, the vital signs and what have you. So what are your thoughts on trial management and monitoring and the data components of it? How do you deal with that in a virtual setting?
Yeah, so even in traditional, pragmatic clinical trials, the way they've been conducted for dozens of years, and especially in the last, say, 10 years, the concept of risk-based monitoring, using data to help to drive study conduct and decisions on where there's risks in the trial has become more important. Well, when you think about a virtual clinical trial and the addition of digital technologies collecting data, in a lot of cases in near real time or in real time, there's a lot more data to analyze. And so with patient safety being first and foremost in any trial, collecting information when there's an adverse event or severe adverse event emerging is clearly still very, very critical. So the idea that the data being collected in a near real-time basis and the increasing amount of data that's now available because of digital technologies is even making risk-based monitoring even more and more important, so that the tools that we've deployed in support of RBM now get fed with this additional kind of source of data that is live and coming in. It's not discrete where it's just an office visit once or twice a week. It's coming in every minute potentially. So we need to have the downstream systems that already existed before this for risk-based monitoring be now tied into this live and active data, so that the charts and graphs and just alerts that are triggered to indicate potential adverse events happening are now being watched real time. And this will go to, of course, our larger discussion today on the cognitive centers and their role in potentially looking at all that and managing that. But certainly the data that's being collected in this new virtual way is augmenting existing data and now making it more available for analysis to make sure that the trials are conducted safely and that we can actually get information back to the medical professionals on the trial to intervene when necessary.
Another nugget there. Design up front, adaptive and agile, data, right? And we're talking about data environment that needs to be tremendously scalable, but it's real time and it has to be analyzed. And you need people that are aware of that and understand that. And the point that you made, and sometimes we forget it. People are volunteering for trials. They expect to be kept safe. They expect that if there's an adverse event, someone's going to respond to it. So, Jim, these are really good points. One of the basic points that I thought of, when we were talking to some of our clients, and it's a simple thing that sometimes you might not be thinking about because you're thinking about informed consent and regulatory and everything else. But the actual point that when a patient is in a clinical trial going to a setting, they're usually receiving their supplies or their investigational drug or the placebo in the setting of the site. Now, all of a sudden, we're saying, no, you're going to be in your home. So now we have to basically ship those aspects that you usually saw within a site to the patient's home. So now we have to deal with controlling shipments, the appropriate handling, chain of custody, handling shipments in transit, as well as in the patient home. Patients are not medical professionals. They're consumers. They're people just like we are. So how are they going to manage that? How are we going to ensure they're taking the drug according to the protocol? All right. So there's so many things that you have to think about that you wouldn't think about in a traditional, trial setting. And lastly, when the trial's over, how do you return any of the investigational drugs or supplies? Because that has to be handled in the most appropriate way. So, I think you guys have hit really those main differences, and obviously the important ones are the informed consent, differences in how you communicate to regulatory authorities, differences how you capture data and analyze data, differences on how you supply the materials for the site. So, now these are all great points. So let's transition a little bit. Jim, you kind of mentioned the contact centers, and what we've talked about up till now, just kind of in a summary, is we talked about virtual clinical trials and the benefits. We hit upon patient centricity, patient convenience. We hit upon the benefit that sponsors, investigators have in this new setting. We also talked about the differences that have to be considered. E-consent, digital technologies coming into play. Shipments, monitoring, data capture, data scalability. We hit those early nuggets you guys came up with. Design it up front, adaptive and agile, data. But there has to be another major change, and we know that, and that's part of our conversation today. You can't just change where care is being given and provide the responsibility to that person who's participating in the trial without supporting them. And that's where contact centers come into play. So Ram, what are your thoughts about contact centers in this new context, in this new world of virtual clinical trials? What's their role, and what should they be doing in order to better prepare for whether providing information to patients, connecting trial sponsors to investigators to patients, and really playing that key role kind of in the middle of all of this? What are your thoughts?
Sure, Steve, it's a great question, and it's a very important topic for sure. So think about this, right? We talked about patient sites and sponsors. We talked about a shift of trends towards the decentralized or clinical trials, the hybrid settings, so on and so forth. It's a change management exercise for everybody involved, and it's not going to be easy. So as we design, for example, the study protocol, the informed consent form has to be designed appropriately, ensuring that these modifications to the traditional setting are incorporated and patients are advised about all of these things up front. So a contact center would, in my opinion, would actually play a tremendous role. However, having said that, it's important to have knowledgeable subject matter experts manning the contact centers. In other words, let's make a distinction. You will have operational challenges, or let me give you an analogy. A typical help desk or a call center will have a level 1, level 2, level 3 support. If you look at password resets, or my device is not functioning, or I'm unable to download my app, or any such thing, it's a level 1 kind of a thing. And that's very operational. Then you go on to level 2. When you get onto a level 3, as an analogy, in the typical call center parlance, you'll actually see that you need a medical professional here, somebody who's knowledgeable, who understands the study design, the protocol, and the health conditions. What in case there is an emergency unblinding required, for example. So you need knowledgeable professionals. So having a contact center, number one, is vital, so that the change management exercise can be managed effectively among these three participants, patient sites, and sponsors. But the second thing is, what sort of training, what sort of professionals are actually manning the contact centers? What's the workflow? How are these tickets being assigned to some of these? I think that entire process needs to be looked at very carefully. And again, as I said earlier, this is all planning, Steve. This is where the design and planning have to go right up front. You can't come in the middle and start solving problems. That will be chaotic. It'll throw everything into a disarray. So bring everything up front, include a contact center, figure out who's going to man those things. And by the way, don't burden the sites any more than they're already burdened right now. But it's important that the contact center people are absolutely educated on the study. Otherwise, it won't work. Because this has to be done in the regulatory settings, Steve.
All right, so it's all about change management and rethinking how we staff a contact center. So their responsibilities have grown, but unless you do that, then you're risking your trial, right? So that in many cases is the main point of contact for a lot of patients. Fantastic. One of the things that is interesting that I was thinking about the other day, we were talking to a client who's looking to do recruitment, and Jim kind of alluded to this before. In the past, I think we were, and in some sense we are today, we look to have our recruited patients within a certain distance from a site. Some people have said 30 miles, some said 50 miles, some say within an hour of a site. Well, the reality is if we go to a virtual trial, that really goes away, all right, because the site is the patient's home, all right? But it also then, to your point, puts more pressure on the contact center, because now contact centers have to be aware of the fact that, patients are in different time zones. Patients speak different languages. So, in a more traditional sense of a clinical trial, you probably don't think as much about that. But in a virtual trial, it's critical, because if you can't support the patient within their home, then the likelihood of you being successful and retaining that patient is very small. Would you agree, Ron?
Absolutely, Steve. Absolutely, on the dot. So clearly, I think while recruitment is vital, retention and engaging the patients is even more important. And so these are the typical challenges, Steve. Coming from a traditional CRO services kind of a play, I have fundamentally experienced that delays in study and shifting of timelines and budgets are fundamentally because you're not able to retain patients. There's a dropout rate that you're not able to control, and so on and so forth. So anytime you kind of look to do this stuff, you're better off actually finding ways to engage patients, clearly. I think that's absolutely vital. By the way, you brought up something very important, Steve. We talked about informed consent form a short while ago. And think about this now. In a virtual setting, if it is actually better to have a call center communicate with the patient in a language of their choice, which is what they preferred when they signed off on the informed consent. If you can keep those two things in sync, that would go a long way. Essentially, then you're respecting the fact that they were advised and educated on an ICF in a certain language, and the help desk and the contact center actually is able to cater to their needs through the duration of the study in the same language.
You just described what patient centricity is all about. You know, speaking the language the patient speaks, providing them the tools that they can use and use successfully. Again, it's one of those things that the more you talk about this and the more you consider what needs to be put in place, you realize there's a complexity. You know, the devil is always in the details. And right now, you know, without having a strong contact center strategy, you're really risking your ability, as you said, to recruit, retain, engage, and complete your trial. So, so Jim, going to that, you know, what do we do? You know, how do we, you know, much like we said, patient centricity in a virtual clinical trial, how do we provide that within, you know, the call center? Do you have any thoughts about that, or the contact center? You know, what do we need to do to make sure that these teams are aware of how their role in the clinical trial process? I know Ram just described some of that. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Ram struck to the heart of it when he mentioned earlier this is a change management exercise, and you know, the call center is not going to be immune to that, right? They're going to need to really think about how they've operated in the past and take that and advance the ball even further in various ways. We mentioned, you know, speaking in the language of choice, but you know, even to that point, the idea that the call center is going to be fielding potentially in this new model an increasingly amount of volume of patient interactions, they may not have been used to that before. So where you know, it's something that they have to prepare for. So technology is the part that is one of the pieces that is changing the paradigm in these virtual clinical trials, right? So is the call center trained sufficiently enough to be able to make the experience with the patient kind of frictionless, right? To make it easy for the patient to figure out how to go about fixing, because they're stressed out. They're trying to do something in the trial, they're not sure they're doing it correctly, and so they're trying to follow instructions. And so, yeah, obviously the phone call is always there. Talking to a human is for many people the only way to go. But even for others, maybe it's more of a chatbot or self-service portals, things like that the call center may or may not have done in the past, are now going to be in play and really required to have that full spectrum to make that experience for the consumer and the patient frictionless in this case. So, you know, the idea is that with centricity being the core element here, a patient that is nervous and feeling like they're not being supported is not going to survive the trial. We have to change that quickly. So the call center, the cognitive center, has to be early on adaptive to those needs. They're going to come quick and in volume, so to speak. So in this case, the technology support pieces, how to escalate that. So even if the contact center can't solve every problem at the first call, how do they escalate that to the right people? Is the vendor going to have to get involved of a lot of these devices, right? And so is there a direct line to that vendor so they can really get quick resolution? A new device may have to be shipped out, things like that, handling that quickly so that the trial is not delayed and derailed unneededly. So I think that's part of this whole kind of human touch in all of this. You know, it's always been part of a trial, but it's usually been enacted in the actual site, physical site, seeing the medical professionals and nurses. In this case, it's not happening as much. The human touch has to come from folks like the call centers and others that interact with the subject on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you raised some good points. You know, being part of a digital consultancy, you know, this concept around omni-channel engagement, it really is across all industries, whether it's banking, you know, whether it's the insurance business, whether it's consumer products business, and we're seeing it in healthcare. You know, we're seeing it, you know, with virtual doctor visits. I know Ram mentioned that earlier, and I think you're going to see that more and more in contact centers, because as you said, Jim, you know, that is the main touch point when you go into this kind of virtual environment. So not only do we have to hire the right people, they have to be trained the right way, they have to potentially know different languages and what have you, but you have to also digitally, you know, enable them. And I love the concept, and we're seeing more of in other industries coming to this industries with automation. How do I automate some of the level one things so that those are easily handled? Maybe it's a chatbot, maybe it's some other way. You look at voice, chatbots. You look at mobile portals. There's so much technology that can be brought to this. The one thing I always caution people, and I want to get your perspective, and I've always said to our clients, technology for technology's sake is not a way to solve your problems, and quite often not using just off the shelf, not that they're bad, off the shelf tools, maybe is not exactly what you want to do, because each of your consumers, your patients have different needs. And the only way to figure that out is by talking to them. So I know in our world, we do a lot of what we call voice of the consumer, where basically we engage the consumer or patient in a process up front to take part in the design, all right, to actually see prototypes and really watch them using them. It's fascinating to see someone using technology when they're not really aware that you're watching them. It's part of a user experience kind of pilot. And you start to see what works, what doesn't work, things you took for granted. And I think that's the one thing as a takeaway. I won't say it's a gem, because I think it's something we all are aware of. If we're designing something for a patient, we have to talk to the patient. And we have to talk to them, as Ram said, before the trial starts. Once the trial starts, and where you'll find that issue is in your call center or your contact center. Because if you provide a technology that's not meeting their needs, that's going to really show up in calls to the contact center, because people are going to be frustrated, and people are going to say, you know what, I can't participate anymore. So I don't know, what are your thoughts? Obviously I feel strongly about the voice of the consumer and getting them engaged, but what are your thoughts? Ram, you seem to be smiling there. Is this a familiar theme for you?
Sure, Steve. So I agree with you 100%. So let's touch upon a few things, right, which are important. Number one, taking the patient's opinion and including them upfront, as you pointed out, and we've been discussing now during the design phase and planning phase, is vital, right? So much is changing in terms of these technologies we're talking about. So it's important to kind of make sure. And by the way, you mentioned something else, Steve, which caught my attention, which is don't just use technology for the sake of using technology, but other way around. Does your study design in your protocol for that indication, does it actually need some of these things? And if it does, go ahead, because this is the era of wearables and Bluetooth connectivity and data being transmitted, etc. But don't go the other way around. Then you'll be complicating matters. So always start with what's required for your study design protocol, and then drive it down, number one. Number two, Jim mentioned something else, which is having your standard operating procedures in line, because so much is changing. It's important to document all this stuff. So call centers, sites, patients, sites and sponsors, everybody is fully on board with the SOPs. The third thing is perhaps also, Steve, to have something like a dry run or a pilot run. Don't just get into a study environment live, but rather do a test run, if you will, with some of these things. And there are always learnings, by the way. And we kind of wanted to talk, and certainly the topic is cognitive. And the way I see this is, with so many studies and so much of experience that we have amassed in a traditional sense, some of these conditions like rare diseases, ultra rare diseases, clearly the patient population is very small. They're geographically spread out. Clearly, I think there are some learnings about that aren't as much as compared to the traditional indications. But my point being that the lessons learned in the traditional execution should be leveraged appropriately. Coupled with some pilot runs or dry runs with the technology landscape and the SOPs being modified to accommodate all this stuff. And two, leverage historical stuff and become cognitive, as in, can these instruments be automatically sending messages? If a message gets sent out, is a call center person adequately equipped to be able to interpret some of those things? These are considerations we should, again, use and discuss upfront and alert the patient that such things could happen, by the way.
These are great recommendations. It does show the call center becomes really key to this, and planning becomes key to this. And I keep going back to that kind of thought that it's very iterative. You got to learn. You're learning through everything you do, through every interaction you have, and you need to adapt that as quickly as you can in order to meet patient needs and meet the trial needs as well. Jim, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that as part of that whole change management mindset, being hyper reactive to patient feedback and even feedback coming from these digital devices collecting data 24/7 is new to a lot of clinical trial design and just a lot of new to sponsor organizations, and being prepared to react to that quickly is going to, in the end, have very much determination on whether you have a successful virtual clinical trial or not. And I think the call center plays a very big role in the success of that piece. Just reiterating, having the change management plan in place, bringing this information in early, getting the feedback early, and adapting quickly to that is going to ensure that we have a call center that can move with our patients and keeping them, keeping the frictionless kind of idea moving along.
Yeah, no, I love that term, frictionless. And mixing the right amount of human touch with the right amount of frictionness. And I think that's success. What's interesting, and maybe this is the last question, and then we could see if there's anything from the audience, but when we talk about contact centers, much of what we're talking about, you're talking about, standard operating procedures, you're talking about doing dry runs, you're talking about changes in how they're operated, how they're managed. All right. Well, I could see people coming to me saying, well, that costs money. That's a transformation. How can I justify that? So, Rob, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, how do you find that balance? Obviously we're focused on the patient experience, patient centricity. On the other side, there's an operational cost to doing that, particularly with a new paradigm, maybe where you're introducing new technologies, a different level of support. Like, how do you make the right call on where you're going to make your investment?
It's a fabulous question, Steve. Clearly, contracting and budgeting is a very key component of this entire exercise, by the way, where a lot of time is invested, even in the traditional sense. So think about it in the traditional sense, and my way to look at this aspect of contracting and budgeting is, in the traditional budgeting process, you have certain line items. These are the traditional ways that CROs typically go about working with sponsors to get things done. If we are switching over to a decentralized, mobile technology-enabled, convenient to patients, with patients being front and center to this stuff, if we're switching over to that mode and introducing technology, clearly there's going to be a spike in costs. But my way of looking at this is, we've been talking about risk-based monitoring for a while. We've had these digital technologies. Yes, COVID-19 pushed us all to accelerate the adoption of some of these things. But if we don't remove some of the line items, which are cost line items in the budgeting and contracting in the traditional sense, and do not find ways to replace them with a more efficient, scalable, faster turnaround with digital technologies, we will not be able to compare apples to apples. So my way of looking at this is, the efficiencies, the accuracy, the speed, the quality of data using digital tech in a decentralized environment are all things that we should certainly go towards. But if CROs don't shift away from their current mindset to reduce the dependency on some of those line items, which are cost line items, which add up to a substantial amount. Just let you know, for example, just in recruitment areas, about 30% of the study cost is towards recruitment related areas. 80% of the studies, Steve, fail just for recruitment, by the way. So if we talk about it, but don't want to shift or change, then that's a challenge. So my way of looking at this is, take the traditional line items in your budget, replace it with the technology part. Yes, you will see a spike, but overall, this is far more efficient, and it's going to be healthier because you might be able to shrink the elapsed time, Steve. So the economies of scale around shrinking elapsed times may be better off, and that's a better trade-off, if you will, than sticking to the conventional way of doing things, which are the CRO's list of line items.
Yeah. What's interesting, a question came in right on that topic, Ram, with rethinking the expense and how you're spending money, and how you need to measure this, and that's what the question is. How do you measure success? In a call center where you now have kind of changed it, you've added more capabilities, you put more responsibilities, and you're willing to make that investment. Well, everyone will tell you, if I'm making an investment, I want a return. So what metrics did you use, with whether it's your company or with your clients, on measuring, the success of, a contact center, call center?
Steve, assuming that question's for me,
Yeah.
I would essentially that in a traditional setting, Steve, the metrics and the elapsed times and the costs involved are more or less known. Everybody in the industry pretty much operates to a certain some kind of a template, if you will. If it's a large CRO, yes, the numbers might shift towards the higher end, but if it's a small to mid-sized CRO, there are certain things. So my way of looking at this is take the before and after. The before is a traditional setting. The after, of course, is with the interventions that we discussed on this call. And if you start looking at the elapsed times, the effort involved, the scalability that can be obtained, and at the end of the day, if our novel endpoints, by educating patients and ensuring we are objectively collecting data, analyzing, are ending up speeding the trial process, those to me are clear metrics where we have gotten the ROI. Essentially, it allows sponsors to go to market faster, Steve. Otherwise, in the traditional setting, you have all these well-defined things saying, hey, from point A to point B to point C takes so much time and so much money. If you're not able to shift by replacing them with something else, there's no ROI. But I think there's a genuine case for it now.
Good answer. Good answer. Well, guys, we're coming to the end here, and I know there's some questions, and we'll get back to the people offline. I do want to give you each a minute or two on kind of your final thoughts about what we talked about with virtual trials and the role of contact centers. So Jim, why don't you give a minute or two what your thoughts are, your recommendations are?
Sure, Steve. Well, as someone who's still actively involved with working with sponsors on clinical trial conduct and enabling digital technologies, I find it a very exciting time. As a technologist myself, I love to see when technology is brought to bear to improve lives, and I could see a direct impact to Ram's points on how overall we're making trials safer, making more cost effective, and in the end, if we can actually save time in running them, that actually is bringing potential life-saving medicine to market sooner, right? So in the end, the call center is going to help enable all of those things through direct interaction with not only medical personnel, as they have been doing, but also with patients in this new model. And so the cognitive call center has a core role in that success of enabling digital technologies and remote trials and digital trials and this whole process.
Great. Ram, your thoughts?
Sure, Steve. So I agree with Jim. But my way of looking at this is clearly that it's a highly regulated environment, and so much advancements have happened in technology, and we are so fortunate to have the regulatory support being extended to us right now, and them being flexible in listening to some of these things. But at the end of the day, I think while we keep patient centricity, convenience of patients, and essentially bringing safe and effective therapies to patients much faster, we also have to keep in mind things like the EU GDPR at the back of our minds, Steve. Anything to do with patient privacy violation or anything to do with confidentiality beyond what's been agreed upon in informed consent, those are things that we should watch out for. And the challenge I foresee, Steve, is if this is not planned out and designed and carefully thought out with all the participants of the ecosystem up front, and if something were to go wrong, this would just go negative in such a fast manner that we'll have to take us time to recover. So we all have to be doing our diligence in that regard to ensure that we kind of abide by the rules of the engagement and abide by the regulations and compliance rules.
Very good points. Very good point. So, just a quick recap. We talked about the role, the importance of virtual clinical trials with respect to an alternative to traditional trials and placing the patient at the center. And that's the expectation that we're seeing more and more. There are benefits for patients, for investigators, for sponsors. We talked about some of those great nuggets that we pulled out here. Design it in up front. I think that's a big takeaway on virtual trials with respect to regulatory and other things. They have to be adaptive and agile. Expect things are going to change. Expect that you need to move fast. Jim, data, right? It changes that dynamic to real-time data, to scalability, and the need to do that. Change management, all right? Everything's changing. You just need to plan for the change. Standard operating procedures. I like the concept on dry runs. I don't think we do enough of that. And really, ultimately, getting the patient, getting the investigators, getting them all involved in this kind of voice of the consumer, voice of the patient, and plan for that. So I think this has been a great conversation. I thank you both. Very appreciative of you giving up your time this morning and some great information. With that said, I thank all of our attendees. Any questions that are outstanding, we will get back to you. And let me hand it off to Kamal from Hexaware to close us out. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Steve. Great inputs. On behalf of Hexaware, I would like to thank all the participants and the panelists for all the time for today. As we clearly see during this pandemic situation, virtual clinical trials are becoming very critical for the success of CROs and pharma companies. All the aspects of clinical trials like patient recruitment, patient retention, engagement, and contact center support are getting redefined based on the current situation we are in. And Hexaware has been supporting some of the world's largest CROs and pharma companies to navigate through these changes using digital technologies. We have been providing services to in the clinical trial areas for more than 15 years. If you want more details, please reach out to us. Megan has put together a poll. She will initiate that. If you can give your inputs for the same, it will be great. And thanks again for your time. Have a nice day ahead. Over to you, Megan.
Yes, thank you very much for that. And thank you, Steve, and to the panelists. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. You will also receive a follow-up email within 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of Hexaware and our presenters, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.